We are very excited to have a new speaker this morning, Robert Prechter. And he is known for his work in financial prediction using something called the Elliott Wave Theory. But today, he won't be talking about that. He'll be talking about George Peele, one of the University Wits. Robert has recently completed a 24-volume digital book, which proposes that many publications from the era were actually written by the Earl of Oxford in his younger days. So without further delay, welcome Robert Prechter.
It's very nice to hear some of the famous names among Oxfordians are here today. I appreciate that. I have to tell you that about the big sacrifice I had to make to be here. This morning, my daughter showed up at the door. She took one look at me and said, "You can't do a Zoom presentation with your eyebrows looking like that." So she dug into her bag and pulled out various torture instruments, one of which was a tweezer. I think Rosa Klebb must have had that in her kit. Anyway, long story short, I'm still recovering emotionally. So if I go off the rails anywhere, you'll understand why. Now, just to introduce this idea and let you know who George Peele was, he was famous for producing plays, pageants, and poems. One of his plays was a history play called Edward I. And of course, Shakespeare had a history play, Edward III. His pageants were for the city, and his poems, for the most part, celebrated major events at court, such as the annual celebration of Elizabeth's accession to the throne, tournaments involved, and so forth. So he was a highly placed court poet. We're going to focus today on two artifacts left by George Peele. One was a personal letter written to Lord Burleigh, and the other one is a manuscript of one of those poems that he wrote. It was a letter and gift combination. On January 17th, 1596, George Peele sent to Lord Burleigh a newly polished version of his blank verse poem, A Tale of Troy, along with a short cover letter. And I'm going to delve into the question, might the Earl of Oxford have written this letter? And what we're going to do first is examine the circumstances around this letter at that particular time. In other words, let's start by asking what was George Peele doing at that time. And this is a complete list of the circumstances known about George Peele in 1596. People didn't know whether he had any children. They didn't know where he was living, and they didn't know what he was doing. Now, Oxford circumstances fit from several angles, and we're going to be looking at those. First of all, of course, the letter is to Oxford's father-in-law, Lord Burleigh, so that's a connection. In the cover letter, Peele says that because he is too ill to travel, he is having the packet delivered by, quote, "this simple messenger, my eldest daughter, and necessity's servant." Well, there's no record that George Peele had any daughters. If you read his biographies, you'll find that people say he had daughters, but this is the only reason why they say it, because it's mentioned in this letter. Of course, Oxford did have daughters, and if you'll notice, the term eldest, he could have used the term elder if he had only two daughters. So the implication is he had, three or more. Well, Oxford happened to have three daughters. The eldest daughter was Elizabeth Vere, and let's keep in mind that she was Burleigh's granddaughter. Now, Robert Greene in one of his books and Thomas Nash in one of his books both used the phrase pater patriae, father of the country. Peele's salutation is a bit different. It begins salut parens patriae, basically meaning greetings, patriarch of the nation, or parent of the nation. Now, parens patriae happens to be a legal term. George Peele had no legal education, but Oxford did. And as many people have noted about Shakespeare, legal knowledge comes out as part of his writing. And I think this was in Peele, quote unquote, mind as he wrote this note. Now, parens may also be translated as grandfather. Peele's illness and confinement match Oxford's. Oxford's letter of August 7, 1595 speaks of my health, which is not so good. And Peele's letter speaks of a long sickness having so enfeebled me. Peele's letter of January 17th says necessity requires him to appoint a courier. And Oxford's letter just 3 years later says he must communicate through others because I could not travel up and down myself. Now, what about the timing with respect to Elizabeth Vere? On January 26, 1595, she married William Stanley, the 6th Earl of Derby. By early August of that year, Oxford had retired to Hackney, coming there from Channing Row. And this is the key point. Oxford's daughter went with him to Hackney while her husband stayed behind with Burghley. We know that because in a letter to Burghley dated August 7th, 1595, Oxford writes, "My daughter hath put her trust in me, both to remember your lordship and her husband." So she was with her father and her husband was with Burghley elsewhere. If Elizabeth Vere had stayed at Hackney during the Christmas holidays, might she have returned to her husband on January 17th, 1596, bearing her father's letter? How fun it would have been for Elizabeth Vere, then 20 years old, to entertain the household by showing up at Grandpa's door with the gift and the accompanying clever note. Speaking of the note, we're going to take a look at it. Here it is, a copy of it on the right. This is reproduced in Greg's book, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now let's ask the question. This is just a gift note. It's not meant to be anything great. Should we expect it to sound like Shakespeare? I thought there might be one or two echoes of Shakespeare in this note because I was pretty convinced that the Earl of Oxford wrote it. And I was actually surprised with how thick it is with Shakespearean sayings. In fact, every single line of English in Peele's letter peals of the bard. And I'm going to go through all of them because you have to see how dense and how frequent these connections are. And we're not just going to point out one word here and there that Shakespeare used. We're going to show that he used the very same constructions, often with the same terms. Peele writes, "In these terms, I am bold to salute your lordship." In Henry VI, Part 2, Shakespeare writes, "It makes me bolder to salute my king with ruder terms." Peele addresses right honorable and speaks of your high deserts. And Shakespeare speaks of honors on your high deserts. Peele says to Burghley something about England's great designs. Antony says to Octavius something about our great designs. Peele writes about earned praises, Shakespeare about earned praise. Peele uses personification to speak of envy's mouth. Shakespeare speaks of envy's reach and envy's hand. Peele says, "Pardon, great patron, this rude encounter." And in The Winter's Tale, there's the following: "Apollo, pardon my great profaneness." Peele speaks of a rude encounter, and Shakespeare even connects those two words in Cymbeline. "This rude place we live in, well encountered." Peele speaks of so mean merit, Shakespeare of so mean condition. Peele uses your wisdom almost as a synonym for you. Shakespeare uses it very often, such as in this quote, "Confine him where your wisdom best shall think." Peele speaks of the simple messengers, and Shakespeare has this distempered messenger, this churlish messenger, using an adjective all those times. There's personification in Peele. He speaks of necessity's servant, Shakespeare of necessity's pinch. Peele speaks of a long sickness that has afflicted me, and Shakespeare has Timon, in Timon of Athens, speak of my long sickness. And as most Oxfordians know, Timon of Athens is considered one of the most autobiographical of Shakespeare's plays. Peele uses the word bashfulness, so does Shakespeare. He uses impudency, so does Shakespeare. He uses presume to greet, and Shakespeare uses presume to with a verb 6 times. Peele uses set down to mean to write. Shakespeare uses set down 44 times. Peele uses the word accidents with an adjective in front of it to mean incidents, not just mistakes. And Shakespeare does the same. We have memorable accidents from Peele. We have happened accidents, future accidents, and this night's accidents from Shakespeare. Peele begins a line, "Receive it," and Shakespeare does this 3 times. In Cymbeline and Othello, he says, "Receive it from me." And again in Cymbeline, receive it, friendly, and each time it begins a sentence. Peele speaks of duty's signification. Shakespeare speaks of duty's rights and duty's sake. Peele says, live long in honor and prosperity. Shakespeare, for which live long to thank both heaven and me. It's kind of interesting. Both of those lines are in an iambic pentameter. They could almost make a couplet. You've got live long in honor and prosperity, and for which live long to thank both heaven and me. Near the end of the letter, Peele mentions Queen Elizabeth's gracious countenance. Now, Shakespeare comes very close to that when in Henry V, when someone is speaking of a horse, he says, his neigh is like the bidding of a monarch, and his countenance enforces homage. So he's connecting the countenance again with the monarch in Shakespeare. Peele inserts a couple of lines of Latin and a Greek with one Greek word. The best I could do was to render it as follows. But what parrots vale succinctly expressed, quote, the belly is the teacher of the arts and the bestower of genius. Well, the quotation is an aphorism from the Roman satirist Flaccus. Did Shakespeare ever pair a Latin saying with the word parrot? Yes, he did. In the Comedy of Errors, he does exactly that. In the quote, Mistress, respice finem, respect your end, or rather the prophecy, like the parrot, beware the rope's end. That is a lot of connections, and I think very good connections. Here's a presentation of Greg's typing out of what Peele had written in his note. And I've yellow highlighted all the terms that we just found in Shakespeare. You can see we didn't have to go through a 60-page book to find all these. It's absolutely packed with them. And remember, this is 1596, so it's well into the Shakespeare period when Oxford was writing more of the plays, and he'd written many of the plays. So many of the phrases and terms and constructions that he had put together were part of his mind, and they just poured out in this note to his father-in-law. Now we're going to look at another document. There's also a manuscript of Peele's poem titled Anglorum Ferii. It was discovered in 1909 among the papers in the lodgings of the president of St. John's, Oxford. This poem was never published. If you'd like to see more pages of it, they're available on the British Library website. This particular poem celebrates the tilt held on Accession Day, 1595. Here's a picture of one of the pages from it, and we're going to investigate this poem, at least part of it, for Shakespearean influence. These are the first 5 lines of the poem. Descend, ye sacred daughters of King Jove, Apollo, spread thy sparkling wings to mount, and try some lightsome sweet Castalian springs that warble to their silver winding waves, making soft music in their gentle glide. Now that's certainly the kind of quality that Shakespeare puts out, but is it Shakespeare? Let's take a look. Shakespeare's language shows up in these lines. In fact, all of what I'm going to show you is in only 4 lines of it. Peele speaks of wings to mount, and Shakespeare writes mount with wings. Peele writes of silver waves. Now, that's not exactly a commonplace. I mean, most people would write about frothy waves or white-capped waves or something like that, rolling waves perhaps. But Shakespeare likes that too. He also writes of silver waves. Peele bids Apollo to spread thy sparkling wings. Shakespeare in Henry VI, Part 1, speaks of a king whose arms spread wider than a dragon's wings. Peele bids Apollo to try Castalian springs. If you search the Shakespeare canon and his plays, you won't find that, but you will find it in a very interesting place. Shakespeare's dedication to Southampton in Venus and Adonis begins with a pair of Latin lines that include the words Apollo, Castalia, and Aqua. It's the same reference. And finally, Peele speaks of waves and their gentle glide, and Shakespeare speaks of the current that with gentle murmur glides. That's 5 parallels in 4 lines, and they're good parallels. I think Shakespeare wrote this poem. Now I'm going to spend some time on the handwriting involved in both of these documents. Greg's book, which I mentioned earlier, is titled Literary Autographs 1550 to 1650. It was published in 1932. It shows the handwriting from 142 writers of the day. Among all those letters, Peele's is the most like Oxford's. That doesn't prove it is Oxford's, but it is the most like his. And that right there is a 1 out of 142 probability. Now I'm going to say handwriting analysis is not vital to Peele's status as a voice of Oxford or as a persona of Oxford's. Because as we know, Oxford had secretaries. He had quite a few of them. Nelson cites a 1592 letter from Oxford in which an amanuensis begins it and Oxford takes over. So sometimes he would pace the floor and dictate, and sometimes he would say, move away, I'm going to finish it myself. So he could well have used someone else to write it if he were dictating it. It's a possibility. I really don't come to that conclusion, and I'm going to show you why. I think Oxford hand wrote it. And to compare some of the writing, I used an early letter of Oxford's from 1572 and a later one from 1594. Oxford had certain unusual, if not unique, handwriting habits that he maintained throughout his life. He crafted distinctive uppercase E's. You can imagine why, because his signature was Earl of Oxford, capital L's and capital T's. All three forms are on display in both examples of George Peele's writing. On the left are some random E's I pulled out of Greg's book. On the right, you can see put together several of Oxford's and Peele's E's. If you didn't know whose were whose, it would be very difficult to tell them apart. In fact, one or two that might look a little different are actually by the same person, either Peele or Oxford. You can see, at least in my mind, they're very, very close. Now, most people, when they write an L, a capital L, use the same style of stroke, either curly or angular, at both the top and bottom. And here's a bunch of names from Greg's book, all of whom use the curly form, especially at the bottom. Nicholas Udall renders an L that is angular at the top and the bottom. That's the way most people operate. Well, Peele and Oxford did it differently. They formed their L's, I say identically, but let's say very similarly, at least, in an unusual way, with a curly top and an angular bottom. And they stuck with that. That's an unusual L, and they shared it. They also wrote ST in the same way. They often use a capital T in the middle of words, or even at the end of words. And that was especially true when the T followed an S. And here you can see some examples from Peele and Oxford. I think they're extremely close to each other, and you have to realize that they were written for different purposes, basic letters, and the others are poetry and so forth. Some of their lowercase letters I would call identical or nearly so, such as lowercase e's, lowercase b's, and lowercase f's. This doesn't prove that the writing is the same, but it's a pretty good argument and pretty good display, in my opinion. Among the 142 writers whose handwriting is displayed in literary autographs, none of them shares even two of the uppercase handwriting quirks that we just looked at. Peele and Oxford use all three. Now, there is a difference between the two sets of writing. Peele's writing is more cursive, making it somewhat fancier, grander looking. I don't think that's unusual. I think it's perfectly natural. Most of us write more cursively for a poetic composition or a birthday card than on a grocery list. And the Oxford's letters that I used are practical correspondence, they're business correspondence. Anglorum Feriae is high poetry. And Peele's letter is a grandly composed gift note commencing Salut Parens Patriae. I think Oxford, when he picked up the pen to be George Peele, was playing a role. And when he did that, he made sure that the correspondence or the poem fit the role of a high court poet. That there are so many graphical correspondences, which we just looked at, despite the differences in purpose among the documents, I think is pretty remarkable. Now, there is one more record of Peele's handwriting, and we're going to see if we can link that to these other two items. A receipt from the University of Oxford, dated May 26, 1583, this is 13 years earlier, shows that George Peele was paid £20. Now, that amount equals about 10 grand in today's money. and he was paid it in respect of the plays and entertainment of the Palatine Lasky, that is the Polish Count Lasky. The event was a staging of William Gager's Dido and Rivals. And this is a copy of the receipt wherein George Peele's name appears, and he also signed the receipt. You can tell by looking at it that they had left the middle portion blank for someone to fill in the name and then sign. I think it's because they didn't exactly know which name Oxford wanted to use for this production. But in any case, you can see that the signature on the letter from 1596 matches the signature and also the inserted name on the receipt of 1583. So one person is behind all three of them. If Oxford wrote Peele's letter, he also signed for George Peele's expenses relating to the production of William Gager's Latin play Dido in 1583. We talked about the possibility that a secretary had written this other stuff, but I think it's rather unlikely that he would have been filling out the receipt in 1583 and then become available 13 years later while Oxford was retired at Hackney to write the note to Burleigh. So I think Oxford hand wrote all of those items. Well, is there any connection between Oxford and that play? There's no connection between Peele and that play that I know of, but Shakespeare recalls that very production. As Eva Clark noted, Hamlet recalls Gager's production fondly, musing, quote, "The play I remember pleased not the million, 'twas caviar to the general. One speech in it I chiefly loved, 'twas Aeneas' tale to Dido." So we have a play here which entertained a general, one from caviar country, not the public, the million. Will Shakespeare did not attend that play because he was in Stratford upon Avon at the time, and no one would have let him into the halls of the university to see it anyway. What we have then in Hamlet is Shakespeare reminiscing about a play on the same subject and acted under the same unique circumstance as Peele's production for Gager, for which Oxford signed the receipt. Peele happens to share one of Shakespeare's passions, and it's a passion for none other than the Earl of Southampton. In 1593, Peele wrote a blank verse poem of over 400 lines, The Honor of the Garter. Southampton had not even been nominated for KG, yet Peele serves up praise. For his sake that lives and now survives, in honor of that name, to whom my thoughts are humble and devote. Gentle Risley, Southampton's star, I wish all fortune that in Cynthia's eye, that's of course the queen, Cynthia, the gloria of the Western world, with all the stars in her fair firmament, bright may he rise and shine immortally. Now this was written the same year as Venus and Adonis. So we've got Shakespeare writing sonnets about the youth and dedicating a poem to Southampton, and at the same time, Peele is feverishly supporting him to be nominated for KG. Well, of course, people will say, oh, well, he was just trying to get some patronage from Southampton, but let's see how far he went and see if it really fits the idea that he wanted £5 from the guy. The Honor of the Garter correctly identifies 25 of the 26 founding members of the order. In place of the actual 7th founding member, the Earl of Salisbury, Peele substitutes the Earl of Southampton, even though, quote, there were no Southampton founding members of the order. Whoever did this, whether it's Peele or Oxford, of course I'm saying it's Oxford, knew that there were no heirs to the Salisbury earldom in 1593, so there would have been no interested party to protest the substitution. Now, I think that's going a very long way to try to promote the Earl of Southampton. We know Oxford was doing it at the time, and here Peele seems to be just as hell-bent on having Southampton advanced in the eyes of the Queen and the realm. Well, there happens to be a physical description of George Peele. Oh my gosh, is this going to throw my whole thesis out the window? Because if they describe George Peele and it's different from the way the Earl of Oxford looked, obviously we have a serious problem. William Gager wrote a poem in Latin describing being plucked by the elbow by George Peele. And then he adds some strange words, or someone like him. His words say, whoever he was strangely short of leg, dark of complexion, squint-eyed, and red-haired. Now, I would submit that no one on the face of the earth has red hair and a dark complexion, except perhaps a full-time Irish sailor. And what's with squint-eyed and strangely short of leg? Well, that doesn't sound like the Earl of Oxford, so maybe we're on the wrong track. In fact, most biographers seem to believe it must be, quote, as one of them said, basically descriptive, because, quote, what else can lines 5 through 6 mean if they are not descriptive of Peele? Well, let's see what else they might mean. In An Almond for a Parrot, 1590, Cuthbert Currynave, an obvious pseudonym, describes the anonymous Martin Marprelate as follows. Eternity consulted with conception to make him squint-eyed, and the devil made him with red hair, a black face, short feet, and damaged in one eye. Now, how did Peele and Marprelate come to share nearly the same absurd physical description? J.B. Steen came to the rescue and realized that it was a Latin quotation from Martial's epigrams. Notice that Marprelate is a pseudonym. I think the connection with Peele, who was a persona of the Earl of Oxford, fits there as well. So in fact, there is no physical description of George Peele. It's a joke. And remember that Gager said that someone had plucked him by the elbow who was quite like George Peele. I think the Earl of Oxford was standing with his buddy, Gager, chuckling and chortling over this poem as they wrote it together. Now, there was a George Peele, but as far as anyone can tell, he was not the George Peele. And these are some quotes from various biographers. Most of the extant Peele records are financial and legal, and none expressly connect him with the canon that bears his name. Does that sound familiar? That sounds like Will Shakespeare to me, with his financial dealings and a legal proceeding, and nothing to connect him with the plays and poems in his name. 35 adults named Peele can be identified in London at that time. They were laborers and artificers of uncertain employment. That again, to me, sounds like Will Shakespeare. And this one is important. There's not a shred of evidence to connect them, any of them, to the poet's family. The poet's family, presumably being the family of James Peele, the father of George. And then we find that James Peele left more record of his activities than did his more noted son. That's rather amazing. James Peele was a clerk of a school for poor children, and he left more records of activities than the guy who was sitting there at all the tournaments, writing poetry and writing plays for the court, putting on pageants for the city. Somehow nobody ever bothered to mention him in those capacities. Now, here's something important. The Register of St. James, Clerkenwell records the death of, quote, George Peele householder in late 1596. Now, you would think if they were talking about the George Peele, who was the poet, it would have said something like provider of royal entertainments and pageants for the city of London, but it just says householder. And I think for the real George Peele, that's exactly what he was. Some other interesting points. Peele wrote handsomely, as we've seen, yet he left no body of correspondence, just the one note to Oxford's father-in-law. And here's an interesting point that many biographers have noticed. Peele did not employ as literary subjects the people he knew best, or should have known best, the middle classes. In fact, nobility and royalty feature in every one of his works. These juxtapositions produce what the scholars have called a paradox. They haven't tried to resolve the paradox, they've simply noticed that it's there. And I think our identification of George Peele resolves the paradox. Where might Oxford have gotten the idea to use George Peele's name? Well, James Peele, the father of George, of a George anyway, was clerk of Christ's Church Hospital, which was a school for poor children that started teaching in 1552. In 1553, he wrote an accounting book and dedicated it to the treasurer of the Court of Wards. And obviously, someone teaching a lot of poor children would probably have been involved with the Court of Wards from time to time. Lord Burleigh became master of the Court of Wards in 1561. So one would think that he and Burleigh would have known each other after that time, if not before. James Peele also wrote city pageants in 1566 and 1569, and that certainly would have interested the Earl of Oxford, who was theatrical at a young age. And Oxford, at least by my determination, wrote a prefacing poem under the initials AG for the second edition of James Peele's accounting book of 1569. Now, AG, of course, are the initials of Arthur Golding, Oxford's uncle, and I think he was providing a poem for James Peele's book and implying that his uncle provided it. The poem begins in yielding every wight his own. It is in 14ers, just like Ovid's Metamorphoses, which had been published 2 years earlier. So I think that's where Oxford got the idea to use George's name as a voice. The identification of Peele as a voice of Oxford is based on what I would call too many coincidences. The story of Peele's letter fits the circumstances of Oxford, Burleigh, and Elizabeth Vere. Hamlet reminisces about a play produced by Peele as private entertainment for the court. Peele shares Shakespeare's passion for Southampton at the same time. Peele left no body of correspondence. Peele, the writer, left virtually no evidence of having existed. The only two items I can recall are the receipt, which we've already dealt with, and I think one person claimed to have paid him £3. Peele's letter and Anglorum Feriae are packed with Shakespearean expressions, and that, I don't use that phrase lightly, they are packed with them, as are Peele's other works. Peele's biography is a paradox. We can solve it with this solution. Oxford knew Peele's father, and something I haven't mentioned so far, Peele, like Robert Greene, was subject to posthumous burlesques after Robert Greene, quote unquote, died. And I wrote a paper for the Oxfordian about why I and several other people think that Robert Greene was another persona of Oxford. After he supposedly died in September 1592, Gabriel Harvey immediately published a burlesque of his death, where he's lying on his deathbed and he's only got a sheet to wear. He died of pickled herring and he's staying at the lodgings of the sister of a notorious criminal and all sorts of crazy stuff. And after George Peele died, somebody came out with a book called The Merry Conceited Jests of George Peele. So they could poke fun at someone who had died because he hadn't really died. At least the writer, George Peele, hadn't really died. Okay, let's get back to the gift. I think this gift fills in a missing segment, and a segment of what I'll show you in a moment. In 1596, William Warner completed his blank verse epic of 12 books titled Albion's England, covering England's history from the time of Noah up to Elizabeth. In my book, Oxford's Voices, I propose that Oxford is the author of Albion's England, at least the first 12 books. Now, the first 4, you can take that or leave it. We're still going to see a gap that's interesting. The first 4 books, completed in 1586, might have been the impetus for the Queen's decision to pay Oxford his annual stipend, which started that year. The only portion of England's history that Warner did not versify is the story of Troy, the city that, according to legend, produced England's founder, Brute, the grandson of Aeneas. Peele's A Tale of Troy conveniently fills in the missing portion, and only the missing portion, of Warner's verse history. So now we have the entire history of England up to Elizabeth covered in verse, I think by the same person. Why would Oxford choose an improved treatment of that book as a gift to his father-in-law? Well, Burleigh helped Oxford attain his annuity from the Queen. There's a long letter that Oxford wrote to Burleigh in 1586, basically saying, look, I've done all this stuff. I want you to help me out and get my money from the Queen. And a couple of days later, he's got his annuity. So the gift, as Peele himself wrote, signifies a scholar's duty to his benefactor. I think his gift says, in essence, here is the rest of the verse history that helped you champion me as Elizabeth's poet. So thank you. Why does Peele's letter still exist? A lot of Oxfordians, and I agree with them, believe that the Cecils destroyed much correspondence from Oxford. I think that correspondence probably mentioned some of its projects as writing under others' names. So why did they keep this letter? I think Burleigh must have cherished this clever correspondence with its impish method of delivery from his own granddaughter. a salutation to grandfather at the beginning, and figured that no one would ever link it to Oxford. If so, my belief is he miscalculated. And why does Anglorum Ferii still exist? One reason may be that the poem never made it to press. So Oxford's practice may have been to destroy manuscripts once the material was in print to get rid of evidence that the credited writer was not the actual writer. This one was never published, so it somehow still laid around and was found by luck at the University of Oxford. It's a dream of Oxfordians that someone will discover manuscripts in Oxford's hand of a play or poem by Shakespeare. I'm going to read one of my favorite lines from any movie. I know you've all seen it. It's called Anonymous. And near the end of the movie, Ben Jonson character turns to the Anne Cecil character and says, "My lady, you, your family, even I, even Queen Elizabeth herself, will be remembered solely because we had the honor to live whilst your husband put ink to paper." And I think what we have here is an instance where that very husband put ink to paper. We have a manuscript, likely in Oxford's hand, of a narrative poem signed with someone else's name, in this case, George Peele. Was not just simply say, oh, here are some indications that this person really was a front for some of Oxford's writing. I had to contrast that with the writing of people who were independent. So I also studied 300 independent writers, or people that I've determined are independent anyway. Most people think they are anyway. And then explained why each one of them was not a front for the Earl of Oxford. And they usually had telltale signs or reasons or facts about them that proved they were not, usually multiple signs and facts. And then, of course, on each one of the people, or names rather, that I believe were voices, I had to explain all the reasons why I felt that was true. So it was really a weaving project. So every time I read something new, I would take parts that were important. Very often in the Orthodox writing, it was in footnotes and endnotes, where they discovered all sorts of fascinating things about why this particular writer was reminiscent of another one and so forth, wove it all together. At the beginning, I have a long introduction, but I think it's all necessary. And I ask people very kindly if you will point out any place you think I've made an error in any way. Please let me know. I'm keeping it online for a few years so that it's a living book and I can make changes and edits and fixes and additions if I need to.
Thank you. And I have a question for you now from Cheryl Egan Donovan. How do we know that the A.G. preface poem was written by Oxford, and why do you think several other letters from Oxford were not destroyed?
The letters from Oxford that were not destroyed are ones that didn't reveal anything important about the fact that he was posing as other people. As far as the poem goes, I've got a short page on it in the George Peele chapter, and you can take a look at it, or if you like, I can just excerpt it and send it to you at some point. I think he already used his uncle as a voice for Ovid's Metamorphoses. So I think he just used it a second time.
Here's a question from Michael Delahoy. Do you think Locrine, sometimes credited to Peele, should be part of the Shakespeare canon, like the troublesome reign of John?
I believe that's one I did tag for Oxford, yes. In fact, on the plays that are anonymous, I've got a whole section of plays that are anonymous and they haven't convincingly put them in one person's canon or another. Locrine is one of them.
Here's one. How do you reconcile this tale of two old men with the career of W.S.? Thanks to Shakespeare Authorship Roundtable for its openness to various scholars.
Well, I don't think we have to resolve very much. Peele's not known for that many items. I think it's, maybe a dozen items. Oxford would have weaved them in, I think, without much trouble from the early 1580s until the mid 1590s with his other output.
I was comparing your thesis to the way I operate on Facebook. I have my own personal page where I'm saying who I am, and then I have many different organizations and ideas that I post about under different names. They're not under human names, they're under other kinds of names, but it still allows me to put all of my ideas about one subject in one column, basically, and still get information out there to people who are interested in that particular part. I know Facebook wasn't around at the time of William Shakespeare, but it just seemed similar to me.
Well, they had Paul's Churchyard. You know, one post you could have had some books by Shakespeare, and another post books by Peele, and so on. Another one with Robert Greene, who knows? Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's a thesis of heteronyms where some authors take on complete personas to write different things. And I think Oxford did that in one or two cases. Not in Peele's case, but in a couple others.
Here's something from Michael Delahoyd. I caught the Silver Waves connection to Comedy of Errors, which I'm currently editing. Did you have an earlier connection I didn't catch?
No, I haven't mentioned anything about that. It's just the same two words are in Peele's letter. And I'll bet you that's through many of the works that I think Oxford wrote. In fact, I could probably search that on my book and see if it comes up numerous times. I wouldn't be surprised.
That's right. You can search because it's not a piece of paper.
It's instant search. Anytime you want to see something, it shows you right where it is, how many times it occurs, what pages they're on, and one click brings you to one after another. So yeah.
Michael says that you'll be in a note. I'm assuming that's when he publishes his Comedy of Errors that he's editing.
It's an honor. Thank you.
Here's something from Cheryl Egan Donovan. If the 1593 blank verse poem, The Honor of the Garter, under the name George Peele, why use Shakespeare for Venus and Adonis?
He used many different names. And in fact, most of them were of real people. I mean, I think George Peele was a real person. I think John Lilly was a real person. I think he wrote under Thomas Lodge's name. These were all real people. And in a few rare circumstances, I think he started voices without a real person behind him. Robert Greene was one, Shakespeare was another. Now he found somebody to fill in for Shakespeare when he bumped into Will Shakespeare. It's possible he knew about him earlier, but I think he made up the name. Shakespeare was probably using it as early as the 1570s. I suppose he could have just as well used George Peele for that.
Rima asks, why did he need so many different aliases?
I don't think he needed them as aliases. I think what he was doing was trying to give the impression to the world that England of his day was as full of poets and playwrights and brilliant writers as were ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And he wanted that legacy to stay with Elizabethan England, and it worked. Of course, there were other writers as well. I said I've got 300 independent writers. Most of them don't come near to Oxford's talent, although there were some who were very, very talented. Christopher Marlowe, obviously, and Spenser, Edmund Spenser. He was the Voice's favorite poet was Edmund Spenser. They, I think, were inspired by his early work to come forth. So he not only created a lot of literature in other people's names to make it look as if they were packed with these brilliant writers, but he also encouraged, sort of drew out other people to do the same thing. And that actually did sort of turn the Elizabethan era into a golden age of literature.
So he was playing multiple parts and the stage was England.
Oh, I think he was playing roles. Yes, I think most of the time he just threw out something in somebody's name. I've got an article in the upcoming Shakespeare Oxford newsletter about William Adlington. He wrote one thing, nobody knows who he was. And that was actually pretty common. I think he threw out many items in just a person's name who happened to be around or maybe didn't happen to be around. But some of the times he actually got enamored with one of his voices and stuck with it over a long period of time. Robert Greene is one of them. I think George Peele was less so, but I believe he actually sort of played roles of three different voices, sort of in real life. He would go to places and say, well, I'm George Peele today. I'm here to produce a play. I'm Robert Greene, the guy who wrote all these stories and so forth.
Like he was doing public relations all by himself.
For the realm. I think that's why they paid him his money, because he said, I'm going to glorify the realm through poetry. And I'm also going to glorify your reign by letting the world feel that we're as great as ancient Greece and Rome in our literature, our playwriting, and so forth.
Here, Greg Buse says, if I'm not mistaken, you said on Don't Quill the Messenger that you attribute 2 novels to Oxford. Are those the Euphues novels or something other?
Oh, I think he wrote quite a few novels under different people's names. I think he wrote almost all of both the Euphues books and very brilliantly dedicated one of them to himself.
Jeff Williamson says, question, do you think Oxford tried to disguise his own handwriting at all if he wrote the Peele letter?
I don't think he did. I think he pulled out his pen, lifted it high and said, I'm playing the role of George Peele, and he became very fancy. One other voice where I think he might have either forged a letter or dictated it so someone else's handwriting is involved.
Sandra says, which alias or role was the first? Do you include Arthur Brooke?
Yes, but his first one was T.H. It was a poem about Narcissus. He did that when he was 10. And I think that was the prologue to Ovid's Metamorphoses, because that came out of Ovid. In fact, I think I wrote an article on was T.H. Oxford's first publication. I think it went in Shakespeare Oxford newsletter maybe 10 years ago. But, Oxford had such a wonderful advantage to pull off this feat, especially in a somewhat of a totalitarian society. And that was his extremely elevated social position and the fact that the Queen really liked him. He even got the Archbishop of Canterbury, Whitgift, to personally okay Venus and Adonis. You got to be pretty high up to pull that stuff off. Pseudonyms are not rare, but allonyms are quite rare. And that's why he was able to fool everybody for 400 years, because he used names mostly of real people.
Michael Delahoyd says, well, diverse in voices, 12th Night. It's a quote.
Oh, nice. Thank you. I might use that.